I recommended you read The Wager by David Grann, who is a popular nonfiction writer and American journalist who's well known for writing books of nonfiction, of historical nonfiction books with a narrative flair to them. And this one, The Wager, was quite critically acclaimed, but I want to know your thoughts.
I think this book is not for everyone. I mean, I think it's a fantastic example of how an author can take you to a time period, not only tell you the story, but color in all sorts of pieces with regards to what life was like at the time, sort of the life and times of that time period, along with telling the story. So, I mean, throughout the book, and I can understand why it's critically acclaimed because, he has quotes in there from everybody from Rudyard Kipling to Melvin, who wrote Moby Dick, to others who are in the time period and maybe slightly after the time period, but, really color in details and facts, which would be a high contrast to the way we live our lives today.
It's a book that's incredibly well regarded also, I think, because it has that page turner element to it, in my opinion. At least when I was reading it and in a lot of the reviews that I've seen, you just want to know what happens, especially because the way the book is set up. Because the plot has to do with an actual expedition that happened in the late 1700s, I believe, that was due to launch from England and to go and patrol the seas off the west coast of Chile. And as they go down under the lowest point of Argentina to get past the South American continent and make it to the Pacific Ocean, there's a crash. And this armada of ships gets split up, but it follows this one ship called the Wager and the survival story of the men that were on board. And the way the story is known is because quite a few of the sailors kept journals. And more interesting to me is that this story was actually a sensation when they did eventually make it back home to England. And the way the book is set up is it tells you right off the bat what happens. They did make it back home. It was a sensation and it was very controversial. And there were two opposing storylines or accounts of what actually happened to the ship and what happened on the island that they landed on. The question is, whose account are you going to believe? And the rest of the book is telling the story of what happened, basically merging the two accounts and letting you decide what account do you believe, the captain or the people that apparently reportedly mutinied against him. And there's good arguments for both sides. And I think the setup does a lot of heavy work in this book, in my opinion. So I love this book. It doesn't sound like you liked it all that much. Well, what's your beef with it?
I think I can respect it. I think for me, it was, like I said, I think it was phenomenally well written. I think, and I qualify my remarks earlier in terms of it's not for everyone because, if you're not into sailing and you're not into sort of, I mean, the title is very descriptive in terms of, being a tale of murder, mutiny, and survival. I mean, again, if you're looking for a happy-go-lucky book, this is not it.
Not it. Nope.
Not it at all. I mean, this is literally, men at the edge of survival, of starvation, of the very essence of desperation. In a lot of ways, every time they feel like they've been rescued or, feel that they've got a handle on something, it's horrific. I mean, even if before they get off the ship, scurvy hits, and this is at a time when they didn't even know what scurvy was. So people were dying. They didn't know why. And this tale of survival, just being on the ocean at that time, let alone being shipwrecked in weather and on an island that was completely devoid of life.
Yeah, it made you realize that the danger of just sailing generally from the biggest empire in the world with the most well-provisioned armada of ships like ever assembled, even that was incredibly dangerous. And what if they have like 5 ships with crews of like 400 plus on each? Like this was a massive expedition.
The numbers also speak to it, right? I think there were originally like 2,000 people or something in that neighborhood that sailed from Britain, and only like 200 came back. I mean, it's... and you can see how easily things can go from great to disastrous and then back again. I mean, the Commodore or the admiral of that particular fleet and his sort of accomplishments, as well as the captain himself, who had this entire disaster happen with regards to the wager, but sailed again later in his career and made something of it, which I found really surprising and sort of fascinating at the same time.
It's one of these true stories that is done justice by being told in a way that feels like it's nonfiction. Only the author makes it clear that it's based off real accounts. And it is at times kind of dry, but the content makes it so palatable, in my opinion.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of Moby Dick, although this is a book, to be fair, I have never read. I've seen the play and I've seen certain adaptations because the original is about over 1,000 pages and written in sort of Old English. So very difficult to read on your own. But Melville's account of that entire fictional book is actually based on a real live story of being on a ship that was basically destroyed by a whale. And the men who
I didn't know that, really.
Yeah,
Wow.
and the men who were basically stranded to rowboats, and very similar to the wager, had to resort to cannibalism in some cases. In some cases, 3 boats went out. I think only one came back
Right.
safe. But like you said, it's one of these true stories that if people didn't write it down, we'd never know about it. And there's an old adage, if you don't write it down, it never happened. And you can only imagine if nobody had written anything down in the case of the wager, how this story would have been lost to history, and who knows what would have happened to the people that came back.
And what ended up happening is once this group of sailors made their way back home to England, they published a book. Or I think it was one of the sailors published a book.
Mm-hmm.
It was basically a tell-all as to what happened because this story was already a sensation. And then this sailor decided, like, oh, now's my time to shine. I'm going to let everyone know what really happened. He came out with this tell-all book that sold like crazy. And then the captain of the ship came back and said, no. Here's the real version of what happened. So, like, there's a lot of story behind this story. And that's why it's I don't know where David Grann heard about this whole ordeal, but it feels like this isn't a retrospective that needed to happen because it's such a good story.
It is a good story, and it's sort of an example probably of the first sort of clashes of class and basically public opinion, waging a war in public opinion, because again, this is imperial Britain, right? I mean, royal decrees and the admiralty was everything. And you have this guy who's not even an officer publishing books and writing things into the paper. I mean, that was almost unthinkable for an enlisted man or a commoner or whatever term you want to use. And going up against his captain, no less. And, you can see even in the writing that he's conflicted about, he doesn't want to go against his captain, but he knows if he doesn't, he's basically going to be hanged rather quickly. Yeah.
In the notes that you sent me, you made a really good point that this book is almost like exclusively male. I don't think there's a single woman in this book at any point, which kind of understandable. I mean, it's a sailing ship. They didn't really have women on them back in the day. Still an interesting tidbit. You don't really see that all too often. But I do have to say, it's an incredible story of survival because of the details. What they end up doing is they crash on this island that's on like the southwestern coast of Chile, and through the wreck of their ship, the Wager, they rebuild a couple little rafts. And one of those little rafts, they end up paddling and sailing with a makeshift little sailboat down under Argentina, which is one of the most dangerous waterways in the world, and then paddled all the way up to a little town in Brazil. You're talking thousands of kilometers.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable to be packed on a tiny little barge and being on the ocean for months at a time. Unbelievable.
And packed so tightly with so few provisions. I mean, and then, you have the weather on top of that. I mean, at one point they couldn't, they lost the rudder of the ship too, where they,
yes.
And in both cases,
sail
the captain's account, as well as I think it was a gunnery, the enlisted man, the other party, both parties had, heart-wrenching things where they had to leave people behind because they just couldn't risk it in terms of, in the case of the gunnery, they left people on shore to go forage for food, but then the rudder broke, so they couldn't even maneuver close to pick them up. In the captain's case, they tried to, go back home, and it didn't work, and they just didn't have enough room on the
And
boats.
and Amr, in that case where they had to leave the people on shore, and they said that that was because
Hmm.
the rudder broke, I
Yeah,
find it hard to digest that, because there's also the possibility that they just sent people on shore because the barge was too crowded,
it's
right? Like we
possible, but
know people are lying. We know people are lying in their accounts here because there's two differing accounts. We know there are lies being told here. It's up to us to decipher them.
indeed, and that happens on the captain's account too, right? You have four Marines where nothing
Yes.
is completely, not a trace except for a musket, and you're thinking, how do people completely disappear when they're so desperate? So there's definitely questionable pieces in the book, which I'm sure the Admiralty had questions about when after they returned. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly difficult book to read if if you don't have a strong constitution in terms of being able to basically read about survival on the edge, quite literally, whether you're talking about weather or anything else really.
To anyone who's starting this book and wants to pick it up, I'd say to get through the first 25% of it, because there's a lot of context setting and build up to this expedition. And then you get past a point and you really feel like, okay, the journey's begun. And I fully understand like who all these characters that we're following and what's at stake here and just the scale of this expedition and what's needed. That was The Wager by David Graham.